I still remember the way the fire popped that first night, sending little sparks up into a sky so clear it felt like you could reach out and touch the Milky Way. Jane was curled against me under the blanket, her breathing already slow and even, half asleep the way she always gets when the air smells like pine and smoke. Nick sat across from us, poking at the logs with a stick he'd spent 10 minutes choosing, muttering that he couldn't believe he'd let us drag him out here without a single bar of service. Brian just grinned, leaning back against his pack like he owned the forest. We were 4 hours from the nearest road, deep in the Kentucky foothills, far enough that no one would hear us if we called for help. That should have felt freeing. Instead, sometime after midnight, when the fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the only sound was the light rain starting on the leaves overhead, I heard footsteps. Not an animal. Not the wind. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the edge of our clearing. And whatever it was, it knew exactly where we'd pitched our tents. That morning, I woke to the smell of bacon drifting through the tent and the low, steady croak of frogs down by the creek. The air was cool and sharp, the kind that slips under your skin and wakes you properly. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into pale light filtering through the pines. Jane was already at the fire, turning strips of bacon in the cast-iron skillet, her hair still messy from sleep. Brian was off gathering wood, stacking it in 2 neat piles the way he always did. Kindling on the left, larger pieces on the right. Everything lined up like he was measuring with a ruler. Nick stood just outside his tent, bent forward, hands on his knees, groaning. "Jesus," he muttered. "I've never missed a real mattress this much in my life. My spine feels like it was folded in half." I laughed, walked over to Jane, kissed the back of her neck. She smiled without turning around. Brian came back with one last armful of wood and dropped it beside his perfect fire ring, large flat stones arranged in a near-perfect circle. It looked permanent, like it belonged to an established campground instead of a random clearing 4 hours from any road. "Looks good," I said. He shrugged, smirking. "If you're going to do something, do it right." I almost asked if he'd heard anything last night, those slow footsteps, my water bottle moved to the exact mirror spot across the coals. But I didn't. Animal, I told myself. Just an animal. First night in the deep woods. Paranoia. Jane called breakfast. We filled our plates, sat in the mismatched camp chairs we'd hauled in, and ate while the frogs kept croaking down by the creek. Nick wanted to stay put and read the paperback he'd brought. The rest of us vetoed that. Brian suggested following the creek uphill, a clear landmark, easy to trace back if we needed. After a little grumbling, Nick agreed. The creek was only a few minutes from camp, running clear and cold over smooth stones. Ferns crowded the banks, and every so often the trees opened up to give a view down the hollow, layers of blue-green ridges fading into haze. The water made that constant soft rush that feels like it could put you to sleep standing up. We walked upstream for maybe 30 minutes before Jane stopped and pointed. About 20 yards ahead, right at the edge of the water, someone had stacked stones, not a simple cairn. 8 flat rocks balanced in a narrow tower that leaned at an angle that should have sent it crashing into the creek years ago. The angles were too precise, the balance too impossible. It looked deliberate. Wrong. We all stared. "Who the hell stacks rocks this far out?" Nick asked, voice low. No one answered. We told ourselves it was old, some hiker years back. We kept walking. Hours passed, The sun slid west. We turned around while there was still light, past the stone tower again, still standing, still wrong, and made it back to camp as the first real dark settled in. At first, everything looked normal. Then Nick stopped short. Our chairs. He was right. Every chair had been moved to the exact opposite side of the fire ring. Not roughly across, precisely. Mine, which had been angled slightly toward Jane's, was now mirrored on the far side, same tilt, same distance from the stones. Nick's folding chair, the one with the ripped armrest, sat where Brian's had been. Brian's heavy canvas chair now occupied Nick's spot. Jane's little backpacking stool was perfectly swapped with mine. Brian laughed it off. Wind must have caught them or something. But there were no footprints in the soft ash inside the fire ring. No flattened grass where the legs had been dragged. Each chair had been lifted clean and set down again in the identical imprint it had left before, down to the millimeter. Nothing else in camp had been touched. Our tents stood exactly as we'd left them. Packs zipped. Food bags still hung high between two trees. Just the chairs. Perfectly mirrored. I felt the others watching the tree line the same way I was, waiting for another sound, another movement. We didn't have to wait long. That night we built the fire higher than the night before. No one said it out loud, but we all kept our chairs exactly where they'd been placed. As the rain started again, soft, steady, the kind that lulls you toward sleep, I noticed Brian's two wood piles had been combined into one, and the new pile sat dead center between where the two had been, perfectly symmetrical. I pointed it out without meaning to. I don't even remember deciding to speak. The words were just suddenly out of my mouth, quiet but sharp enough to cut through the rain. The wood. Jane followed my finger first. Her face changed immediately, like something had dropped in her stomach. Nick looked next, his shoulders tensing as soon as he saw it. Brian turned last. The two neat stacks he'd made that morning were gone. In their place sat a single pile, centered exactly between where the two had been before. Same amount of wood, same careful sorting by size. The symmetry was perfect. Jane's eyes flicked from the pile to Brian, then to me. Nick didn't even try to hide it. He shot Brian a hard look, the kind you give someone when you're waiting for a confession you already half believe. Brian scoffed, but there was an edge to it. "It's animals," he said. "Raccoons mess with stuff all the time." He walked toward the pile like he meant to prove it, crouched down, and picked up one of the logs, turned it over in his hands. For a moment, I thought he was going to start rebuilding the stacks. He didn't. He set the log back exactly where it had been. "Doesn't mean anything," he added too quickly. "Let's just leave it." That was the first time I saw doubt touch his face. We talked after that, about tomorrow mostly. Nick wanted to head back early, maybe hike out before dark. Brian pushed back, suggested we make use of the last full day, check out an overlook he'd marked on his map. A short hike, open ground, good visibility. Jane and I stayed mostly quiet, listening to them go back and forth while the fire crackled low and steady. Eventually, the plan settled. We'd leave camp in the morning, spend most of the day out, come back before sunset. A reset. Brian suggested cards to pass the time until the rain let up. Jane and I agreed right away. Nick hesitated, then sighed and sat down, irritation barely masking something closer to fear. The four of us played by firelight, the rain tapping softly on leaves overhead. We joked. We argued over rules. For a while, it almost felt normal again. Almost. Nick was the only one who couldn't hide it. His eyes kept drifting past the edge of the firelight, jaw tight, fingers drumming nervously on his cards. Even Brian wasn't as relaxed as he'd been the night before. I caught him pausing mid-laugh once, listening to something I couldn't hear. When the fire burned down and the rain picked up again, we called it. No one argued. We retreated to our tents quickly, zippers whispering shut one by one. I lay awake longer than I meant to, listening to Jane's breathing even out beside me, counting the seconds between drops of rain. Something woke me. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of one. The rain seemed quieter. The woods emptier. Jane was still asleep. I didn't move. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Wet. They weren't in camp. They were down by the creek. Each step made a soft, sloshing sound, water disturbed just enough to carry uphill. Too steady to be an animal. Too measured. Whoever, whatever it was, walked like it knew where it was going. I stayed completely still. Before we'd come out here, we'd laid out rules. After dark, no one leaves their tent except to relieve themselves, and even then, not far. Always within sight of the fire. Always together if possible. The creek wasn't that direction. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they'd begun. Silence rushed back in, heavier than before. My heart took a long time to slow. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. I told myself it was nothing. I was wrong. I woke up before anyone else. Not because of noise, because my mind wouldn't let go of the creek. The slow, wet footsteps from the night before kept replaying in my head, each one landing exactly where it shouldn't have been. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to Jane breathe beside me. Eventually, I nudged her awake and whispered that we should start breakfast. When we stepped out of the tent, the clearing looked peaceful enough to almost convince me nothing was wrong. Morning light filtered through the trees in thin gold sheets. Dew clung to the grass, catching the sun and throwing it back in 1,000 tiny reflections. A low fog hung over the ground, softening the edges of everything. Then I saw the fire pit. At first I couldn't tell what was wrong. All the stones were there. The ash was there. The half-burned logs still rested where we'd left them. But something about it felt off. Jane noticed me standing there and paused as she went to wake the others. She followed my gaze and stepped closer. "I could have sworn that big tan rock was on the other corner," she said. That's when it clicked. The fire pit hadn't been disturbed. It had been rotated. Every stone had been turned exactly 180 degrees. The larger rocks were still opposite each other. The gaps between stones were identical. Even the ash inside, gray and white from the previous night, looked as if it had been lifted and set back down. Undisturbed, replaced. Nick came out of his tent complaining about his back like always, still half asleep. I let him rant for a few seconds before waving him over. It took him a moment. Then his face hardened. "That's it," he snapped. He stormed toward Brian's tent before I could stop him. Brian gasped when the zipper tore open, scrambling upright. "What?" he snapped back. Nick didn't hesitate. You built the fire pit. You're the only one strong enough to move those rocks like that. You think this is funny?" I didn't step in. Neither did Jane. Brian blinked, confused, then angry, then something else entirely as he followed Nick's finger to the pit. He stepped outside. I watched Nick's eyes flick down to Brian's hands. Clean. No ash, no soot, no streaks. Brian swallowed. "I didn't do this." Nick stared at him for a long second. Then the anger drained out of his face. "You couldn't," Nick said quietly. "Your hands would be filthy." That realization hit all of us at once. The stones were coated in ash. And yet there wasn't a single fingerprint. Jane finished breakfast while the adrenaline wore off. We ate, talked about the hike ahead, about the views Brian promised from the overlook. Even Nick managed to smile once or twice. Before we left, I insisted we organize camp. Chairs folded and placed in front of their respective tents. Food and drinks hung high between two trees. Tents zipped tight. Gear placed deliberately. If anything moved while we were gone, we would know. The hike started smoothly. Brian led with the map. Nick complained about the bugs and his soreness. About halfway in, he stopped short. "There," he said, pointing into the woods. A structure. Primitive, circular, built from logs, branches, mud, and leaves, but shaped with unnatural precision. No doorway, no windows. The curve of the wall was smooth and intentional. 4 intricate stone stacks stood at equal distances around it. Bones hung from branches above, small vertebrae strung carefully. Brian whispered, "Raccoon, possum," something like that. None of us believed it. We turned around immediately and continued the hike without saying another word about it. The overlook was beautiful. Wind rippled through bluish-green grass, the trees swaying in slow unison. We ate lunch, explored a little, made sure not to stray far. For a while, it almost felt normal again. On the way back, I noticed the structure. On the wrong side of the trail. I didn't say anything. By the time we broke through the trees and saw the clearing again, dusk had already started to settle in. Everything was where we left it. The chairs, the food bag, the fire pit. Relief hit me so suddenly it almost made me dizzy. Jane asked if we wanted hamburgers. Everyone agreed too quickly. We ate fast, helped each other without much talking. Like normalcy itself was something fragile we didn't want to risk breaking. When the fire burned low, exhaustion settled in, hard and heavy. I reminded everyone of the rules one last time. Quietly, firmly. No leaving tents after dark. If something felt wrong, you stayed put. All 4 tents zipped within seconds of each other. Sleep came fast. And then it didn't. The scream cracked through the clearing, sharp and panicked. Nick. I was moving before I fully woke, hands fumbling with the zipper, heart hammering. Cold air rushed in as I stumbled out of the tent, the fire reduced to a dull orange glow. Nick's tent was still zipped. But Nick wasn't inside it. His sleeping bag lay on the ground, half twisted. His pack sat nearby. His boots were placed side by side, exactly how he'd left them inside. Nick stumbled out of the darkness barefoot, eyes wide and unfocused. He didn't run. He staggered. When he reached our tent, he collapsed inside it, shaking so badly Jane pulled her legs back to make space. "I was inside," he kept saying. "I didn't wake up. I swear I didn't wake up." Brian's voice came from his tent, tight and strained. "What's going on?" I told him to look outside. There was a pause, then the slow sound of a zipper. His flashlight clicked on. Nick's tent wasn't gone. It was on the opposite side of camp. Same orientation, same stake pattern, turned 180 degrees. Brian snapped. He started yanking gear into his pack, repeating that he was leaving. I grabbed his shoulders and forced him to look at me. "You can't," I said. "You know you can't." Eventually, he sagged and agreed to stay until morning. I went to move Nick's tent back. That's when I understood. Everything inside, Nick included, had been removed first. Then the tent had been rotated. Then everything had been put back exactly where it had been relative to the tent. Even the grass beneath looked untouched. I dragged the tent next to ours, stakes nearly touching. Jane was crying. Nick wanted to leave now. I fed the fire every piece of wood we had left, forcing light into the clearing. Then the woods went silent. Not slowly, all at once. No insects, no frogs, no wind. The footsteps came, slow, measured, one every few seconds. They pressed into the damp grass just beyond the firelight, circling clockwise around the clearing, never rushing, never stepping into view. I couldn't move. They passed behind me once, then again, always just out of sight. Time stretched until it stopped making sense. Then the footsteps stopped. Jane and Nick were asleep. I crawled back into the tent and stayed awake until the first thin cracks of daylight filtered through the trees. Final act. We didn't talk much once the sun was fully up. The light felt wrong, too thin, too pale, like it hadn't fully decided to be morning yet. No one mentioned the night. No one asked if anyone had slept. We just started moving. The rules were gone now. We packed fast, too fast. Sleeping bags shoved instead of rolled. Tents yanked free of the ground, stakes clattering into piles without being cleaned. Gear that had been so carefully arranged the day before was now thrown together with shaking hands. Jane kept looking over her shoulder toward the tree line while she worked. Nick dropped something and swore under his breath, then froze like he was listening for a response. Brian didn't stop moving at all. He didn't say a word. The fire pit was left cold and untouched. When we finally shouldered our packs and stepped onto the trail, none of us looked back. The hike out felt longer than it should have. Not harder, just stretched. The trail itself looked the same, but the spacing felt off. Turns came later than I remembered. Landmarks didn't show up where I expected them to. No one complained. No one joked. We stayed close together, boots crunching in unison over leaves and dirt. I kept expecting to hear something behind us. I never did. When the trees finally thinned and the gravel lot came into view, relief hit me so hard my legs almost buckled. The car was there. For a split second, everything felt real again. Then I noticed the front of it. The car was turned around. Not crooked, not angled. Perfectly reversed in the space, nose pointing the opposite direction from how we'd left it. No one spoke. Nick opened his mouth, then closed it again. Jane wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the tires like they might explain it. Brian just walked straight to the driver's door and unlocked it. We piled in without arguing. The doors shut with solid, familiar thuds that felt too loud in the open air. Brian turned the key. The engine cranked. Once, twice, too long. I felt my pulse in my ears. Jane gripped the edge of her seat. Nick whispered, "Come on," under his breath. The engine finally caught, sputtering to life like it had been woken from a deep sleep. No one laughed. Brian pulled us onto the road, tires crunching over gravel, and for the first few minutes none of us said a word. The trees slid past on either side, dense and unbroken. After a while, Brian slowed. "Which way?" he asked. We all looked ahead, then back the way we'd come. Something about the road felt unfamiliar, but everything had felt unfamiliar for days now. Jane spoke first. Maybe we parked it this way," she said, though her voice wavered. "We've been on edge the whole trip. Maybe we just convinced ourselves it was wrong." No one argued. Brian turned the car around. We drove. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then more. The road kept winding through the trees, the scenery repeating itself in subtle ways. A bend that felt like one we'd already taken. A stretch of fence that looked almost familiar, but not quite. No signs, no houses, no cell service. Nick shifted in his seat. "Shouldn't we have hit pavement by now?" No one answered. Jane stared out the window, brow furrowed. "Guys," she said quietly, "this doesn't look familiar. None of it does." Brian's jaw tightened. He drove faster. After nearly an hour, the landscape started to repeat itself more clearly. The same kind of clearing, the same rock outcroppings, the same dips in the road. That's when I felt it settle in my chest, heavy and cold. Whatever had been in those woods hadn't chased us. It hadn't stopped us. It had simply let us think we were leaving. Brian slowed the car, hands clenched on the wheel. No one suggested turning around again. No one suggested stopping. We just kept driving and driving.